The two things that we want to finish with respect to Aristotle are two pretty well-known aspects of his thought, and any discussion of Aristotle would be a little incomplete if we didn't talk about them. One is the notion of Aristotle's God. I'll put it in quotes because this is not to be confused with the God that you worship as a Christian. But there are at least some points of similarity. And even saying that involves me in a certain degree of controversial assertion. But the heresy detector didn't zap yet, so I'm going to push my luck. But anyway, we've got this whole question of Aristotle's God, and the other is Aristotle's notion of happiness, which I think you may have come across somewhere else, so I just want to refresh your memories with respect to this. I think you'll already be familiar with it, but we'll just touch on it. Aristotle had, in his sort of astronomical speculations, a notion that here's the earth. The earth is at the center of things. And we call that particular view, that cosmology, by a certain word. The view that the earth is at the center and everything orbits the earth. We call that, Matthew,
geocentrism.
Geocentrism or geocentricity. That's the idea. And that was Aristotle's conception. I suppose from the modern point of view, this is where we would think he was the most naive, and obviously Copernicus and others, Galileo, etc., in the scientific revolution really revised that understanding. But that was the classical understanding. And the way he thought of it was that you have the earth and then you have these kind of spheres, transparent spheres, and there's, I think there's like 55 of them. So Aristotle kept looking at the night sky and noticing how things moved. And he noticed, if we were to, I don't know how to picture it, but if we were to just imagine one great ceiling with a bunch of little stars on it, then if we move that crystalline ceiling, all the stars would move together. You follow me? I'm not making a major, profound point here. But if one of the stars was sort of going a different direction, wandering, or, to use the Greek word, you want to know the Greek word for wander?
Wait.
Well, I will wait. I am waiting. Keep waiting.
Have you told us this before?
You may have come across it somewhere. I imagine Mr. Dykstra might have mentioned this.
Didn't we read a book called The Wanderer or something?
In 5th grade.
In 5th grade?
We read some last year.
But yeah.
That was Anglo-Saxon.
Oh, yeah.
All right.
Then, no, I have no idea.
There is the Greek word for wander. Can anybody say that word without me helping? Can you read the Greek script well enough? Ben can, and the word is?
That's planeo.
Okay, planeo or planeo. And what English word would we get from that Greek word? Ben, do you know?
Plane.
Not plane. Very good. Good thought, but it is instead, Josiah?
Planet.
Planet. And so from the ancient point of view, planets wandered. Hence, planet. Wanderers. So I look at the night sky, and I see all the stars more or less moving together in concert, and then I see this one weird planet, or one weird star, going off in a direction by itself. And I cannot immediately account for why one star would wander. So I call it a wanderer. We call them planets. And all Aristotle could figure out was it must be attached to a different crystalline sphere, you see. So you've got stars there, but then you've got, But then he noticed not all the planets wandered quite the same. So there must be several crystalline spheres. And then by the time he'd factored in the sun and the moon and a couple of comets and a few other pieces of space junk, he'd come up with 55, I think it's like 55 or 58, something like that, separate spheres that were all orbiting the Earth, and attached to all of them were these points of light. Well, then Aristotle asked himself, what keeps them going? Because they keep moving, and they seem to have a kind of almost engine, you would say, that prevents them from slowing down. He noticed through his scientific observations that things tend toward rest. That is, we would use the word entropy. He didn't know that word, but things tend toward the state of lowest energy. If I throw a ball, I notice it only goes for a little ways and then it stops and rolls to rest. And he noticed that these stars and planets and stuff weren't slowing down. So he decided there's got to be something which is moving them. But his rationale told him the thing that's moving them cannot be itself moving. There has to be something that is the engine behind this motion, which itself is in a kind of ultimate state of rest. And so he gave that famous expression that became more or less the synonym for his God, and it is the, who knows what I'm aiming at here? You know, Jacob? You mouthed it.
The prime mover.
Oh, close. Yeah, that's close enough. Prime mover or the unmoved mover, right? So for Aristotle, it was a rational necessity that there be some kind of ultimate principle or being or some such thing that accounts for the motion that I see in the universe and is itself not being pushed by anything. It doesn't need to be pushed. It is not in motion. It is eternally at rest, but everything else is moving because of it. And that is then, of course, Aristotle's famous idea of the unmoved mover or God. Yes?
So does he believe it's a being or it's
Let me just kind of walk through that. So your question is very much in order, and I'd like to kind of explore it just a little bit, step by step here. The first thing that he says of this being is that it is a mix. I'm going to get rid of this, but we'll come back to it in a minute. It isn't a mix. He has the two ideas of potentiality and actuality, and I mentioned to you the other day that the notion of God that we have in Aristotle is what? Remember that, Stephen? I said we have potentiality and actuality, but when we come to the idea of God in Aristotle,
God is purely actual.
that's exactly right. So God is pure actuality. No potentiality. Now, if I say that in God there is no potentiality, then I'm basically saying that in God there is no change. No change. Because this being is unmoved. And if there were change, that would imply motion, right? So this being is static and eternal. And then Aristotle thought about, well, if this being is static and eternal and unmoved and pure actuality and no potentiality, what is he doing? And the answer to the question, if you're describing such a being, is this God is doing what? Laura?
I was thinking nothing.
Nothing. Well, that's almost correct. He has to be doing something, but Aristotle is struggling with the fact that he can't be doing anything that would involve any change in his being. And so Aristotle thinks to himself, what is he doing? Well, he's thinking, but he can't be thinking about the creation. He can't be thinking about us, because if, for example, he's thinking about this class in philosophy, then he would realize that by the time this lecture is over, you are much more brilliant than you were when it began. Right? You're supposed to nod. Oh, yes, Mr. Gore, that's good. But of course, if this God is aware that you have become more brilliant, then his knowledge of the change in you would be a change in that God. He's changed because you've changed. So this God has to be eternally unaware of you. So what is he aware of? Sarah, if this eternal unmoved mover is eternally unaware of you, but is aware of something, then the only thing that he could be aware of would be himself. And so this God of Aristotle is eternally thinking only of himself. I use the word himself here somewhat advisedly. Maybe I should say itself. But. So the kind of the little bit more, what would you say, informal way of describing Aristotle's God as he spins this. You'll hear this is not original with me. Okay. I wish I could claim it. I can't. So if you take Philosophy 101, you'll hear it again. But this eternal deity is eternally contemplating his own navel. Isn't that clever? His own navel. That's a part of your anatomy. If you're not familiar with that, go ask Mr. Dykstra, his own belly button.
And there it is.
That's what he's thinking about. So, and you see what the problem Aristotle has is that this is the only way that he can conceive of an unmoved mover. But then you ask the question, well, if this God is only contemplating himself, then how is he moving anything? Doesn't that occur to you as a problem? You start thinking, well, if you just... And so this is really at the heart of Aristotle's notion. This God moves things by the power of attraction. Attraction. Something like a magnet. Or maybe even better, something like, the Mona Lisa. You go to the museum and you walk up to the Mona Lisa and you notice people are attracted to it. The Mona Lisa is not doing anything. She's just hanging there on the wall. She's not even contemplating, well, I won't go there, but she's just hanging on the wall, But everybody's drawn to her. The power of attraction. And in some sense, that's what Aristotle thinks is going on with the unmoved mover. Sidney?
So does he believe that his God is in the center of the universe?
Yes.
So how does that play in with the geocentrism?
That in sense, this God is metaphysically at the center, not necessarily geographically at the center, but in a sense, yes, this God is at the center of things. But he's speaking here in a metaphysical sense. So he's not saying if you drill a hole down to the middle of the universe, you'll find God, or the middle of the earth, you'll find God. But in some metaphysical sense, yes, that would be the idea. All right, the other little, go ahead, Ben.
So basically he spent an eternity thinking about his navel.
Yes.
Has he figured out anything about his navel? So has he always known something about his navel? Or is he completely oblivious of what's
This God has always been there. This God is uncreated. This God is eternal. And so you can't say this God is learning anything, but is gathering complete. And by the way, maybe I should say this. Aristotle didn't use the expression contemplating his navel. Okay, that's not Aristotelian. But Aristotle did say he was contemplating himself. And Aristotle would say that this God is doing so in a state of perfect bliss. So this,
The goal of contemplating something is to find something out. And if you
yeah, well, that's for a human being. But if you happen to be this God, then you don't have to figure anything out. You know it all.
Okay,
So you're
basically he's constantly reviewing everything he knows about himself.
I guess so. Yeah.
Okay.
Right. All right. This God, therefore, moves the universe through the power of attraction. He's not moving like pushing, it's not that. It's just there, and by the power of his being, things are moving. And the other little piece that's extremely important to get in this kind of idea of Aristotle is that this God creates involuntarily and, in a sense, unconsciously. It is involuntary. God doesn't decide one day, oh, I think I'll create the universe. Oh, I think, I'll be like the God in the first chapter of Genesis. In the beginning, God created. This is not that God. This God is just there, and this God creates just by virtue of being there. And in a sense, this God creates kind of the way the sun shines. The sun doesn't wake up one day and say, oh, I think I'll shine today as a big favor to the universe. The sun just shines by its nature. It's just of the nature of the sun to shine. It is just of the nature of this God to create. Okay? So it's an involuntary and in some ways unconscious and eternal activity. And it's that creation of this God that is the power of the motion. This God creates, and in a sense everything he creates is attracted to him as the creator, and hence you have motion in the universe. Do you have the idea? That's Aristotle's God. It's been extremely important in the history of Christian thought, and the problems here are far more subtle than you might at first suspect. Some of you are aware of a movement in contemporary theology called process theology. You ever heard of process theology? Who's taking apologetics? Okay. Oh, well, you may. I don't know if Mr. Fugit's going to treat this or not. But process theology, certainly if you go off to virtually any university, including many Christian universities, you will be exposed to process theology. And it is an idea that basically stands for the notion that God is changing. God is changing right along with the rest of us. God is in a kind of a state of flux and motion. And the process theologians of the 20th and 21st century have argued that unless you allow for this change in God, you are stuck with Aristotle's God, you see. And so they would make the case that if you want to worship this God that was given to you on a silver platter by Aristotle, fine. But if you want to deal with the God of the Bible, then you have to allow that God himself is in a state of flux, change, progress, and so on. And most traditional evangelical Christians find that somewhat difficult to accept, because we have the notion God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, and all of that. So this is a lively debate. It is going on in your world right now among Christian people. And you are going to be involved in that debate soon enough. Even if you've never heard of it, it is out there. And if you continue your academic career, you're going to deal with it. So I don't want to try to resolve that right now. I just want you to be aware this is where the game is played. It's really on this little battlefield of, are we stuck with Aristotle's God or the God of process theology? Is there another alternative out here, which is true to both the great character of God as we find in the Bible, and yet the fact this is the God that steps in, splits the Red Sea, sends Christ, does things, is not obviously just bound up, tied up in a straitjacket in his own ontology. This is a God who can actually play in the game of human life and is not just distant and detached and unaware of us. You'll follow that? So that's hiding behind this little conversation we're having right now. All right. So this is the basic notion of God as you find it in Aristotle. I'm going to leave it behind right now. The other point where it's going to come up is when we deal with the Arian controversy somewhat later, the Council of Nicaea. Arius was accusing the Greeks basically of having an Aristotelian God. And that was part of what drove that. So we'll return to this in the connection with Christian heresy at a later time. Spencer.
Sorry, what was that movement called again? Process
Process theology.
Process
Yeah,
theology.
sorry. Process theology. Yes.
What was Aristotle's eschatology? Like, what did he believe happened at the end?
Aristotle, as near as we can tell, does not have an eschatology in the sense that you mean the word, like an end of history or something like that. I think, not that Aristotle talks about it much, because remember, it was a Jewish and Christian innovation that history is going somewhere. You don't find that in the Greeks. Okay? What you find in the Greeks is a cyclical view of history. Plato has a cyclical view. Aristotle is not so much cyclical, but it's certainly static. And there's no robust idea in Aristotle of progress and a consummation of history or any such thing. So his eschatology would not be nearly as well defined as what you would have in mind, Josiah. Yeah.
Didn't Plato believe in reincarnation?
He did, and that was part of that cyclical.
Okay, so would Aristotle take a similar?
Aristotle doesn't. I'm not aware of Aristotle teaching reincarnation. I don't believe he did. And part of the reason is he did not have the same notion of the soul that Plato did. Plato had a very distinct idea of the soul coming from the ideal world. For Aristotle, the soul is almost as material as the body. It's just a different kind of material. So he doesn't have that same scheme in that sense. Let me give you here briefly Aristotle's proofs. This would be his theistic proofs. There's 4 in particular that have been important. And I want you to note these because I'll refer to them at some time in the future, especially when we get to Thomas Aquinas. And he goes back to these. The proofs that Aristotle gives for a God. This is against the atheistic Ionian philosophers who were naturalists and materialists. Aristotle does believe that there must be a God, and his first proof is what we would call commonly the teleological argument. You know that term, what is the teleological argument? Krista, ever heard of the teleological argument? What is that?
Well, as far as history goes, we are headed in one direction towards something, towards some goal.
Okay, that certainly is an idea of teleology, that things are going somewhere. The teleological argument for the existence of God would make what kind of case? How would you argue for the existence of God based on a teleological kind of premise? You ready? No? Trevor? You know? The teleological argument for God's existence.
I think the teleological argument is something of that there's order.
Yes,
That
that's right. So I'll make the argument. How would you make the argument?
There is order in the universe, therefore there must be there must be a God, but
Okay.
it must be some being that
All right.
already has order.
Okay, well, you're giving a very truncated form of it, but that's the idea. I see design. Design implies a designer. I look at the watch on my wrist here. I see it has the evidence of design. I immediately and more or less intuitively know that this thing had to have been designed by somebody. I didn't just throw the pieces of scrap iron into the dryer, flip it on for 10 years, and out came a watch. It didn't work that way. Somebody somewhere actually engineered this little deal. And so I look at the incredible complexity of the universe around me. I look at the human eyeball, for example, which is incredibly more complex than the wristwatch on my arm. And I say, well, if there had to be design here, then a fortiori there certainly had to be design in terms of the human eyeball, let alone DNA, let alone, all the other stuff. So it's that kind of argument, right? You should be familiar with that. The argument from design. Aristotle makes that case. Design in the universe implies there must be some sort of intelligence somewhere that is imprinting design on the universe as I find it outside myself. Second argument, the argument from first cause. I see invariably in the world around me the principle of causation at work. I notice ex nihilo nihil fit. I notice that if things happen, they can be explained based on prior causes. That is invariably the rule of my observation. And I notice that if there is cause and there is effect, reason demands that you cannot have infinite regress, that there must have been an initial cause that started this whole chain of causal events, and that becomes his argument based on a mix of observation and reason back to a first cause. That's sometimes called the cosmological argument, but Aristotle didn't call it that. Argument from first cause or the unmoved mover. He made the argument based on what's called necessary being. Necessary being, in very short terms, is this. If something exists now, something must have existed eternally. Simple as that. Really an exercise of reason. Because if something exists now and something did not exist eternally, then there must have been a moment when there was nothing. Nothing. No space, no time. Think about that. Let your mind go there for a minute. Think about nothing. Think about empty space with nothing in it. Okay? Let your mind just go there. Think that all there is space. The expanse with nothing in it. Not a particle, not a dust mite in it. Now think to yourself, no space. See? That's what happens. That's very good. Isn't that what happens? The human mind is actually not even able to contemplate such a thing. Aristotle knows that if there is something now, you either have to postulate that something spontaneously came to be out of nothing, which is absurd, or that if something exists now, something must always have existed. If something exists in time, something must exist in eternity. You follow that? As a matter of pure reason, it's called the argument from necessary being. It's quite potent, really. And the fourth one is the argument from motion. Or, if you want to use a more contemporary term, the argument from entropy. I notice that in no case do I observe in the universe things moving to higher levels of energy spontaneously. If I see something move to a higher level of energy, it's because something moved it there. Balls will roll downhill, they do not spontaneously roll uphill, unless somebody gives it a good push. You see what I'm saying? There's a tendency toward all matter to move to the lowest state of energy and to stay there unless acted upon by an outside force. And so I look at the universe and I notice it's in motion. And I know it can't be winding itself up. It can only be winding down. And so I conclude from that, based on the principle of entropy, there must be something somewhere which is a state of energy, and it's not losing that energy. It is, in fact, in a position where it doesn't run out of steam. It is the beginning of this motion that I'm seeing in the universe. It's very much like first cause, but it's a different way of thinking about it. And in terms of contemporary, physics and so on, you'd call it the principle of entropy. He didn't call it that, but we might call it that. All right. Those are classic theistic proofs. They were worked out by a pagan. These are not Christian. They are pagan. But a great deal of Christian apologetics has incorporated them. And this would be classic evidential apologetics, such as you'd find in Thomas Aquinas and a host of others. Okay, so we want to tip our hats to Aristotle, at least acknowledge, that he made that little contribution. So far, so good. That makes sense? Okay, happy? All right. Okay, the other thing I want to mention, which I think you already covered somewhere else in your educational career, comes from his ethics, the Nicomachean Ethics, and it's his notion of happiness. And he works out, and this is, by the way, fundamental to a great deal of his thought. He's very concerned about human purpose, human meaning, and ultimately the best answer he can give for why we're here and what we're about is to be happy, So he actually wrote a cute little song that you may have heard, and the words of it are something like, "Don't worry, be happy." Straight from Aristotle. It's a great song, isn't it? We should make it the Oaks Fight song, don't you think? Don't worry, be happy. Well, Aristotle gave us the notion of happiness. And he said there are 4 levels of happiness. The most basic and rudimentary level of happiness is what he called, who knows? Kayla, do you know what this is? The most basic level, the most rudimentary form of happiness? Think Rice Krispie treats. The most fundamental level of happiness is, Megan?
Experience through your senses.
All right, or just pleasure. We are all going to, I wish I could say I planned this in advance, but it's not quite the way it worked out, but we are all going to experience in a few minutes Aristotle's first level of happiness. We are going to bite into Mrs. Fugit's world-famous Rice Krispie treats. Non è vero? See? Yeah? That's going to happen. And we are going to feel pleasure. And that pleasure is going to translate for us into an experience that we call, in some sense, happiness. But there's a downside to pleasure as the basis for happiness. And that downside risk really comes down to what? Spencer, what do you think? What's the problem?
The problem is it doesn't last.
It doesn't last. That's one problem. There's another problem, kind of related to it. Joe, what do you think? Do you like Rice Krispie treats?
Yes.
Yeah. So you eat one and you think, wow, that really was good. I think I'll do what?
Eat another.
Eat another. And then you do what?
You eat another one.
And then what happens?
And then you're not satisfied.
Then you're not very happy anymore. Then you're kind of sick, This is called the hedonistic paradox. Pleasure will create a certain amount of happiness, but if you keep pursuing the pleasure, eventually it becomes painful. And so while Aristotle appreciates that there's happiness that flows from pleasure, he knows that the more profound happiness in life comes from other places. So the next level of happiness, a little more profound, beyond pleasure, is what? What's his next level? Have you covered this before? You've covered this somewhere. Oh, you haven't? I thought somebody had nodded their head yes when I mentioned this. All right, so what do you think? Any ideas, any theories what the next level of happiness would be?
Maybe love?
Love! Marriage! What brings us together? Not quite. That's actually a little deeper down the road here. Yeah. What do you think?
Virtue?
Virtue is down here as well, in various forms. I'll give you one more guess. Alicia, what do you think?
Probably still ask it, I'm probably wrong.
I can't understand a word you just said. Say that again.
Friends and family.
Friends and family. Not quite, that's actually. All right, his next level of happiness, you'll all immediately realize it. How many of you are playing sports for the Oaks? Wonderful. How many of you prefer to win as opposed to lose? There you go. See? Aristotle realizes that if you go into a competitive situation, you prefer to win. And winning produces happiness of a certain sort.
So does chocolate milk. Thank you, ladies. Or
Kind of a spontaneous expression of
Joey lost
gratitude
last
there.
night, but they
I see. Okay. All right. So anyway, you go in. Let's say Stephen and I sit down and play a game of chess. We go into this game. We both want to win. I, of course, do win. And that happens to make me happy. The problem, of course, with happiness based on this premise is what? What's the problem? Stephen, what's the difficulty with my happiness based on winning and defeating you at chess, which I certainly would do?
I'm sure because you pain, because we caused me pain.
All right.
I lost.
It is called a zero-sum form of happiness. My happiness is at somebody else's expense. We have produced an equal and opposite amount of unhappiness in the world in order to generate my experience of happiness. So it also is a little bit self-defeating. But it's certainly a kind of happiness. The third kind, I'll just give these to you briefly, is giving. Some of you were inching toward this one. Aristotle never read Jesus, but he would agree with Jesus when Jesus said, it is more blank to blank than blank blank. It's a great, well-known statement from Jesus. And how does it go, Jordan? Thank you. And can you finish the thought? Can you fill in the blanks of my verse there? It is more blank than blank. What is that? Jesus says it's related to this theme.
More blessed to give.
Thank you. Yes, more blessed to give than to receive. And the final one is great cause. To attach yourself to some great purpose. Something bigger than yourself. And he realizes that's the highest and most profound. I teach at the Oaks. I get all kinds of happiness because ever so often people bring Rice Krispie treats to school. Jordan, you may go ahead. So that brings me a certain amount of happiness. Sometimes I play chess. Not very often, to be honest with you. And occasionally win. That brings me happiness. But of course, I hate to see these poor students with tears running down their face in a state of, anxiety. I find that the Oaks is a place where I can give. And maybe you find the same thing. And that produces a certain amount of happiness. But I have to say, one of the... I'm over here. Don't pay attention to the man behind the curtain. He doesn't. But the deepest sense of happiness that I get from being involved at the Oaks is believing that I'm attached to some great purpose. I know that someday in the wonderful Oaks institution, Oaks in 200 years is going to be like Harvard. It's going to be a nationally renowned center of academic achievement. And I know that in that place there is going to be the Mr. Gore Memorial Men's Room, right? You know that? Emblazoned on the door. And I believe in that purpose. And it gives me some sense of higher value, higher happiness.